Yeah, so I have problems, and we're going to talk about design patterns, but basically you're going to hear me talk about my problems for the next hour or 45 minutes. And they're your problems too, most likely. I'm assuming a lot of people in here are either designers or developers or engineers, and we all have problems. And specifically, the problems we'll be talking about today are this. This is one of the sites that we've recently worked on, void of any layout. So the kind of stuff I'm dealing with day to day is how do I take something like this, you know, with pretty close to basic markup, just void of any layout styles, and how do I make it look like something like this? How do I actually create the layouts to make this sensible and usable? You know, if we look at this, there's styles and typography and colors and whatnot, but there's no like CSS display, no position, no margins, no padding, all the stuff that make out layout. So really, how do we take this blob of stuff and create this complex layout? So there's a lot of problems to solve here. There's a lot of stuff going on. But since we're designers and developers and engineers, we love solving problems. I'm assuming you love solving problems, because if that's your career choice, you probably made a poor decision, because it's what we do all day long. So looking back at this example, this site is Colorado Public Radio. It's pretty large and complex. There's tons of content. There's news. There's radio. A lot of audio. They have 3 stations. It's all pulling in content, and there's a lot of things there on the page. But if we break this down and start looking at the individual pieces and how we can actually break it down into solvable chunks, see, there's a lot of stuff. There's 2 columns show up in a lot of places. We have this main navigation up there to the right. There's some social navigation. Essentially, it's just 2 columns of stuff. We have this main content and what's sort of like a sidebar along the side. Again, it's 2 columns. And this kind of same problem shows up recursively. Inside the main area, we have a featured area with a big featured image, lots of thumbnails. Again, it's 2 columns. Below that, we have a latest news article and most viewed stories, which is another tabbed interface, a whole nother problem in itself. But again, the overall layout's 2 columns. Right here, we have the thumbnails. Again, 2 columns. Stuff on the right side, 2 columns. So it's the same problem that happens over and over. And so we look at that and we see that there's a good chance that we can apply a similar solution to all those different problems, and makes the whole complex layout much easier to solve. So what we end up with is essentially design patterns. And what design patterns are common solutions to recurring problems within a given context. Some examples after I have some water. So whether or not you're familiar with design patterns, you probably use them all the time. Just to give you an example, we have the WD-40 design pattern. So you probably have a problem in your house. Something's broken. It's not working like it should. So if it should move but doesn't, apply WD-40. You know, it's a design pattern. You can use that to fix all kinds of different problems. You have a squeaky wheel or a squeaky chain on your bike. You have a door that's stuck. Spray a little WD-40 on it, and you're good. But design patterns are contextual. Context is important. So you wouldn't necessarily apply that same solution to other broken things. You also have the duct tape design pattern. If the duct tape design pattern is very similar, if it shouldn't move but does, duct tape it. And you can fix all kinds of things with that, and it works out really well. So today we're talking about patterns that are related to layout specifically. So just to define what a layout is, we have essentially a box, or sorry, that's interesting. There we go. Essentially, you have this framework on your page. A layout's made up of the markup, all the HTML structure. It's very important what order that HTML is in, because that's the default layout that you're going to get. And then inside your layouts, you have other little components that you drop in there. And the ideal situation is that you drop these components into any layout, and the components should pretty much look the same. They should be independent of your layouts. So let's look at how we can control those layouts. There's a subset of layout properties. You have like stuff that control flow, like display, flex, float, clear, stuff that use properties that control positioning. So position, top, right, left, bottom. Z-index has some effect in there. And then you have your box sizing stuff, like the box sizing, the box model, sorry. Margin, border width, padding, width, and height. So these are the things that you can, these are the properties that you really need to focus on in order to adjust layout. So let's look at some patterns. First one is super simple. It's called constrained elements, or it's called, I call it that. We'll see if anyone else calls it that. So constrained elements, give an element a defined width to prevent it from expanding too wide. Okay, that's simple. Just an example, we have text. It's really long, it's not very readable because the measure is a little too long. So we want to make it smaller. Easy, we just apply like a max width or a width, and it's a little bit more readable. So that's nothing groundbreaking. We have that same concept of constraining an element, and we can apply it to other parts of the site. And being that it's reusable, we could even give it a class that we can then drop in throughout our markup to apply these same styles. So this is an example of a site that Ken Woodworth, our VP of Design, designed and built for Create Upstate, which was another design conference in Rochester a couple months back. And you can see it's essentially, it's a long list of like blocks of content. And each one sort of bleeds out to the edge of the page. And we're applying this class to each of these rows to kind of keep everything, from bleeding out to the edge. So this is probably the simplest design pattern you could think of, or I could think of. So we'll go on to rows of relevant content. So divide the screen into rows of relevant content such that the hierarchy and content relationships are preserved across different screen sizes. If you were in Steve's keynote, he mentioned this as well with the, I forget what the site was, but he talked about it was a Starbucks site with the content in the sidebar. So to give an example of this is the same site. And you'll just see we're breaking out the content into separate rows so that when you do adjust the layout down to mobile size or a tablet size, all those content relationships are being preserved, and you don't have sidebar content that drops down below. To give another example of this is the Colorado Public Radio site again. We had this issue where if you look on the desktop version of the site, it does look like one long sidebar going down the side. And we realized as we were working on this that, we were looking at the mobile view the ads that the sponsors purchase, if we just did the typical sidebar, those would get dropped down to the bottom, and nobody's going to want to buy those ads. So what we ended up doing is breaking up that sidebar into relevant rows of content that would then better match up with the priorities in the main content side, so that when you dropped it down, that content could wrap under. So we end up having to use this quite a bit. And this is just an example of what I'm talking about with the ads and those dropping down underneath the main featured article. So one thing we're dealing with layout that's important is naming conventions. And I like to use this pattern that I call layout modifiers. And this is just following a naming convention for classes intended to modify layout. So to give an example of what I mean, we have these general reusable layouts that repeat themselves throughout the site. And one of the conventions that we use is the L -- modifier. I believe the Drupal 8 coding standards for CSS actually specify that it's .layout, I think -- modifier. But so we have, if you picture the markup for this, we have essentially one div that's our layout container. Inside of that, we have an L- primary, L- secondary, L- tertiary. And the reason these are using one dash is because they're actually sub-elements. They're not necessarily modifying the layout. But they do still play an important role in the layout itself. So what we can then do is create a system of classes like this 3-column layout. That's weird. I feel like I'm talking to the wrong sides because my speaker presentation notes are not matched up with that. So here we have a 3-column layout. So we create this class that is L -- 3-column. And for each of these primary, secondary, and tertiary, we're using, just for brevity, I'm using Suzy. Does anyone in here use SASS? CSS? Anyone not? No? Anyone? I guess anyone that didn't raise their hand would not be using it. So this is just a grid framework, so it's shorthand. Essentially what it's saying is we have a setting that says we have a 12-column layout, and each one of these is just saying for the primary element, span 4 columns starting at the first column, secondary 4 columns starting at the 5th, and last 4, 9, creates 3 columns. So then we have sidebars after. It's using the exact same markup. All we do is change the one class, and we can create this separate layout. And then again, sidebars before, we just flip it. Same markup, different order. And triptych, where we put the primary in the middle and run the secondary and tertiary along the side. Drupal has used a similar pattern in their, I think, no sidebars, one sidebar, sidebar first, that are applied to the body tags, or their body classes. Difference here is you'll notice, like I intentionally use the direct selector, that little greater than sign, to specify that I only want these styles to apply to direct descendants in the markup. And the reasons that that's good is, as I pointed out in the earlier slides, we have these recursive layouts. So if we're trying to create 2 columns, using this sidebar after class, if we apply that in a bunch of different places and we have a primary nested inside another primary, then all those styles are going to bleed around, and you're going to end up having to override, overspecify, and do a bunch of stuff. So a pattern in Drupal it's close, but it could be better. So using this same kind of naming convention, or a different naming convention, same pattern, we do this a lot. Sometimes you have like these really reusable layouts that come in handy in a lot of places, but other times you have like a component. We treat like our entities, like our nodes, usually as a component. And so we'll do a slight modification on this naming convention, and that will typically use like the content type and the view mode and treat that as a layout modifier. So we can use article teaser to adjust the markup, whatever we want our teaser to look like. And then we might have article featured or article simple or article full. We tend to do a lot of view modes in our sites. And this is a great way to just help manage that. Gutter pull is the next design pattern. And it's position an item by pulling it into the gutter established by its parent container. So to give an example of this, we have a long article. We have a pull quote in this article. We're just assuming there's margins on either side. And we start out by floating the pull quote to the left, giving it a defined width. And then we give it a negative left margin to pull that into the gutter and let the text wrap around. So that comes in handy if you need fancy pull quotes. It really comes in handy on some of these teaser views. Like I said, we use a lot of view modes. So this is an example of a book. See what this markup looks like. It's very similar to that article teaser markup that we looked at, except this one's a book. It's not an article. So we have a book cover, book title, book authors, book summary. And we can adjust that using the gutter pull. So we add padding to the left of that. And then we float the image to the left, and we give it a defined width. So we're giving it a width that's a little bit smaller than the padding. And then we pull that into the gutter. And that kind of creates this two-column pattern that we can use in a lot of different places. And the good thing about this one is you can use it for, if you adjust the width of this, you can keep that gutter, depending on how you write your CSS, you can keep that gutter at a fixed width and let the other content wrap around, or not wrap around, but flex to fill the remaining space. The other nice thing is that we've added padding to the outer container so that anything else, we don't need to apply styles to every, the title and the byline and everything else to keep it moved over. It's all pushed over with that padding. So, and you clear fix it, and the next thing will not bleed over this article. So another way we can exploit negative margins, which is kind of fun, is margin overflow. Allow an element to overflow its container by applying negative margins to both left and right sides. So here's an example. This is just a typical block in Drupal where you have your block container, the block title, and the content. And you can do some trickery where we just add negative margins to either side of the block title, which will allow that to spill over the content. If you add negative margins to both sides of an element, it actually increases the width of it. So it's mildly useful in those cases. Another place I've used it, where I find it more useful, is in handling like nested sort of grid structures where you have multiple columns and each one has padding on either side of it. And you'll notice that they're all equally spaced, and that's great, but assuming that these outer guides are kind of the edge of our grid, the text isn't lining up. So we can use that same pattern in which we apply negative margins to the outside to compensate for that padding. There's other ways that you can solve the same problem. But again, context is important. A lot of the other ways do rely on like last child, first child, or int selectors, which do have pretty good support now. If you have to support IE 8, then something like this might work better for you. So intrinsic ratios, this one's kind of cool. When the aspect ratio of an element is known, but the target size is not, use padding and absolute positioning to preserve the aspect ratio of an element. Has anyone had to implement a responsive design with videos in it, or using YouTube videos? Yeah, you wish that the max width 100% that works for images would work for videos or iframes, but it doesn't. So here's an example. Got a Mr. Rogers video. It's in the layout, and if we set that max width to 100%, and the layout gets smaller, you'll see, luckily it's not getting squished, but it's getting cropped off, and that's not going to fly. Common solution is to use fitvids.js, which essentially just does this with CSS. So you take your outer container, and you position it relative, and then you give top padding to it. That's a ratio of the height divided by the width. So you have to figure that out for whatever your video is, and that's what fitvids does for you, essentially, is figure out what that ratio is. But pretty much all YouTube videos are going to be the same ratio if that's all you're embedding. So we give it a top padding of whatever that ratio is, and this is essentially exploiting the fact that if you define padding on an element as a percentage, vertical padding on an element as a percentage, that is a percentage of the width of an element, not the height, which you might think it is. So we can use that to our advantage, set the height to 0, padding top, and then we position the video absolutely, set the top to 0, so that height collapses anyway, and then tell it, give it 100% height, 100% width, and now this stretches like you would want it to. So in a lot of cases, that'll save you of having to load an extra JavaScript library with some pretty simple CSS. So I want to talk about grid systems. Grids are a pretty big part of design in general, and I think web design. So a grid system, divide the screen into a series of vertical columns to facilitate the organization and alignment of components. So here's an example. This is the 12-column grid that you all probably know so well. It's the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and you can just see a couple pages on their site where things are lining up. This is nothing really new. I'm not going to go into why grids are awesome. If you want to learn, there's 2 great books. There's Ordering Disorder by Coy Vin, and A Practical Guide to Designing for the Web by Mark Bolton. Both of those are great, and if you haven't read them, I encourage you to. What I'm more interested in is how do you actually implement grids on the web? And so we're going to talk about some of the patterns that exist today for doing that. So one pattern is the gutter grid. And for each grid unit in the grid system, include a gutter to help space content. So this is essentially the same example. I'm sure you guys all know this site. We have 12 columns. Each one of those has its own gutter, and we use that to help add some space between columns and content areas. So one thing we've been doing a lot lately is the gutterless grid. So exclude the gutters from the grid unit. Instead, use empty columns as gutters. So this is that CPR site. Here we've set all our gutters to a width of 0 in our grid system, which eliminates them. And we are actually, on this one, we're using a 24-column grid. We've actually, on recent projects, have moved to a 23-column grid, which when I first saw one of our designers, it had a comp with a 23-column grid in it. And I'm like, what the fuck is that? Like you can't use prime numbers for a grid. You gotta define evenly. But when you're working without gutters, it actually makes a lot of sense because you have 23 columns. You can do 2 columns of 11, I guess, grid units wide with 1 gutter in the middle. So you have 1 column left over. You can do 3 columns, which is 6 grid units. 4 columns, which is 5 grid units. And it actually works out really, really well. So that's what we've been doing lately. I find as a front-end developer, it's much easier to work with because I'm not having to deal with like the padding issues that you saw earlier as much, where you have nested grid items that have padding on either side. So you're using the whole column width. Or in some cases, like it's hard to see in this screenshot, but it looks like this right rail that these things aren't exactly lining up. They are lining up. There's some borders there that are underneath the red, where you see like the news and classical in those titles. That's actually just padding on that block that's pushing that in there. And we can actually, for the padding, use like half a grid unit as our measurement for spacing, which comes in really handy. So the symmetric grid, construct a grid from equal width grid units. Again, this is the same thing, except this time we're not focused on the gutters, just the fact that all our columns are the same width throughout. And the Drupal site, again, this one's using gutters, but the same pattern of equal column widths. There's another one, asymmetric grids, which construct a grid from varied width grid units designed for the content. I do take a little bit of issue with the name asymmetric grid because the way I've kept it in here because I've seen it described this way in a lot of different blog posts and grid systems. But if we look at construct a grid from varied width grid units designed for the content, well, you could still have varied width grid units and something be symmetrical. But the point is that you don't have equal columns throughout. You have varied width contents, so varied width columns that are designed specifically for the content. So say you've got a site with an ad in the right rail or anywhere on the site that needs to be a specific width, and you don't have control over, you can't necessarily resize it responsively. It's got to be that size. So you can design your grid around that ad or whatever the most important thing on the site is. Hopefully it's not the ad. And just build your grid as kind of a system of ratios around that. So in this example, this is an example from Mark Bolton's no longer forthcoming book, which I'm a little bit sad about. He was writing another book specifically on grid systems and announced a month or so ago that he's discontinued writing it. Anyways, you can see that this grid is laid out, around the content. He's got enough room on the right for these callouts. This left rail is proportionate to the color swatches, and it has enough room to add some of that metadata about the t-shirt. But I do want to point out that this is actually a compound grid, which is you create it by taking, in this case, I believe it's a 4-column grid stacked on top of a 5-column grid, which then creates these kind of, I don't know, variations in grid width. But if you look at it, it's still symmetrical. But that's right, the semantics. So another pattern in grid system is class-based grid system. Align elements to the grid by applying a system of predefined classes to the markup. So you probably recognize this kind of system from, say, Foundation or Bootstrap. This screenshot is from Foundation, and essentially the way this pattern works is you have a system of these predefined classes, like large 12 columns, large 10 columns, that when you apply those to an element, it'll be that width or whatever is set up in your grid system. So it might look, you might have a bunch of classes that look something like this. So we have, you know, at a large screen, these should all be 4 columns. On a small, like more mobile grid, they should be 2, 4, and 6 columns wide. The reason there used to be issues with these kind of grid systems in that they weren't very semantic. If you would say, like, I mean, Bootstrap's grid system used to be like span 4, span 6, which that didn't make sense in all these different contexts. So they've addressed the problem by creating small 2, large 4. These grid systems are great for prototyping. Like, the system's already set up. You can just go in, you're writing your markup, you apply these classes, and get the effect you want. I find them very hard, if not impossible, to implement in Drupal because it's so hard in many cases to get the classes you want on every single bit of markup. So you do have to make some allowances for that. So the alternative is a semantic grid system. Align elements to the grid by applying layout properties to selectors using a grid framework. So this allows us to choose which selectors we want these properties, like the width and the margins on. So these are examples. This is like what I was showing earlier with Suzy. We're defining the grid system using some sort of preprocessor, either less or we use SMACSS. So we can say include grid span 8 columns of 1 on a 12-column grid. These are just examples, 3 different grid systems that are all built in SMACSS. It's actually been pretty interesting to watch because they all keep kind of stealing features from each other, and they should just work together. Anyways, there's Singularity. That's Sam Richards and Scott Kellum's grid system. You all probably know Sam from other Drupal events. Suzy is another one. That one has probably been around, that has been around the longest, and the newest version is actually awesome. That's my grid framework du jour, because they've pretty much just taken all the good parts from everything, and I find it's very powerful, and I really like the syntax. So all these are doing the exact same thing. You just see the differences in syntax. And then the last one is ZenGrids, which is John Albin's grid system, which was based off of, you know, the work that he did in the original, not the original, but early Zen theme. So yeah, highly encourage you to check one of those out. So another pattern for creating these columns is the float layout. So create columns by floating a series of elements with defined widths. So we've got this float layout, 3 items, fairly simple. We just set the width to 33%. Let's make them a third, float them, and then add some padding if you need them. This is how the 960 grid system worked, or still works if you still use it. And this allows you to, one nice thing, or can be a nice thing, that if you change the width of a column, it's just going to naturally wrap around. So this works really well if you have, say in Drupal, you have a view of, I don't know, user profiles or something, and you want them to be 3 up or 4 up. And you can apply this simple float layout, and it'll just apply. It doesn't matter how many you have. They'll just wrap around as space allows. An alternative to that is isolation layout. So given a series of floated elements, give each a negative trailing margin in order to reset the orientation of the following element. So this is, I think John Albin is typically credited with coming up with this solution. So we have a similar layout to what we had before. Things are floated. They're all 33%. And then what you do is, so on the margin, the right margin, or whatever the direction that you're reading from, you actually set a negative margin to pull the next element back on top and kind of reset its orientation. So then you can take that and move whatever your columns are independently from the other one and kind of push it into whatever spot you want. And this is how, in some of those early examples, we're able to kind of flip the order of columns. It also, because these things overlap, it takes care of any rounding errors that the browser might have that rarely come up, but they do come up. So you see, just adjust the values. And I think, like when this was first applied to Zen, a lot of people had a hard time like wrapping their heads around like all the math that goes into it. So if you opened up the CSS file for the Zen theme, there was tons of comments on like what you have to multiply together and all the relatively easy but tedious formulas that you had to apply to do this. So with these grid systems, like a semantic grid system, it takes care of all that math for you. It makes it super easy. One other nice thing is that you can sort of mess with the flow and the floating a little bit to sort of create 2 independent-ish columns. So here we're floating the primary element left and the secondary right. And then the tertiary element is clearing left. So that clears the primary element, but not the secondary, and allows that secondary content to flow down further. And it's one thing, I think this is a shortfall of Singularity. It's not very easy to do this. Both ZenGrids and SUSE allow you to easily choose which direction you want to float things. And this is how we were able to do that Colorado Public Radio sidebar with the margins that flowed down. So now, talking a little bit about Drupal layouts. Unfortunately, I wanted to focus more on the actual CSS and didn't really have a lot of room to talk specifically about the Drupal layouts, but since this is a Drupal event, I do want to share some thoughts about that. There's a few places that currently, and I'm speaking to Drupal 7, good places to actually tweak and control the layout. And those are kind of your big sort of macro template files, like the page file with your page template with all your regions defined in it, or inside the node, or a node has typically a lot of fields. You can create these regions in your node template and drop your fields into those, or the user profile template. This is what we found that between the page template file and the node template file, we can actually get really far with our layouts, and that's been pretty successful for us. Editing a lot of template files has gotten a bad rap in the past because you end up with a lot of template files and a lot of duplicate code. One way that we've been able to address that is using theme hook suggestions. Anyone here actually use or create their own theme hook suggestions? a couple. That's super handy because so if you have a node and it's an article content type, Drupal core will give you some theme hook suggestions that you can use out of the box, like node -- article, or I think there's one for view mode as well, so node -- article -- teaser, whatever. But you can create your own, and that allows you to group similar. Say you have a bunch of different content types. They're all resources, but they have the same general layout. You can create a template, or a template called node -- layout, or whatever you call it. And then in preprocess or whatever, add a theme hook suggestion for that, and then Drupal will pick that up. So it allows you to share templates across content types. It'll work with any theme hook in Drupal. Another thing that I've found super helpful are the CTools layouts, and these are normally associated with panels. They also work in Display Suite. I believe they work in Omega 4X. I believe enough to put it on my slide, but I haven't actually used it. And the great thing about these is that, it creates this separate concept of a layout that's independent of any other kind of idea in Drupal, in that they're not associated with a node, they're not associated with fields or any other theme hook. They're kind of their own kind of independent entity, or not entity, bad choice of words. But the great thing about them, what's that? Yeah, thing, a Drupalish thing. The really cool thing about it is that you can define your own regions in a CTools layout. So you're probably all familiar with theme regions in Drupal, and you define those in your .info file, and you have a ton of them, and you start creating ones that apply to maybe one specific layout on your site. It doesn't make sense anywhere else, and you get this huge long list of layouts that apply theme-wide. So everywhere your theme's used, these regions are used. And what the CTools layouts allow you to do is actually define specifically what regions you need in a specific layout, which I find to be really nice. So to create your own, it's a CTools plugin. Essentially, all you need is a .inc file. You don't necessarily need a thumbnail, but it's nice. It improves the user interface. You need the CSS that actually floats your columns or does whatever layouts you want, and then the template file. So the .inc file is just a plugin. It's an array. You give it a title, the category where it's going to show up, if it has a thumbnail, the actual theme hook, which is the name of your template file, and then the CSS that applies to it. I don't have it in here, but you can also define admin CSS, which is nice. So you can have separate CSS. It's maybe a little slimmer or stripped down for the actual panels or whatever interface. And then you have your actual regions. And then this is just a thumbnail. If anyone's interested, and I have like a little Photoshop template that I use to actually quickly create these thumbnails. And if someone wants me to post that, come and talk to me, and I'll give you a link. The template file, unfortunately, my syntax highlighting is jacked up, so it added a lot of HTML comments where they shouldn't be. So ignore that code. Or at least ignore the comments in it. Those shouldn't be there. And then, basic CSS. So back to patterns in general. There's some places you can go and find patterns that aren't necessarily specific to layout, but there's a site called uipatterns.com, and unfortunately this one's out of date, but of any online resource, I think they do a great job of actually creating or defining these patterns, because they go into detail as to like when it's appropriate, what problem is this actually solving, and really breaks a pattern down to its core components. Unfortunately, it's a little outdated, but it's worth a look. Luke Wroblewski wrote a blog post on multi-device layout patterns, which are layout patterns specific to mostly responsive design, but they could be applied independently of a responsive design. Just how do you manage the same content across different devices? Brad Frost wrote one on responsive navigation patterns, and he's got this collection of, and it's actually expanding beyond just navigation, but different patterns and the associated like CSS and markup for different responsive components. Outside of that, there is the Design Patterns book. This is more programmer-oriented. This is written in, I believe, the early 90s, but it's specific to object-oriented programming, and I believe C++. That's been spun off into, you'll find pattern books on, how to implement these same patterns in JavaScript and whatnot. But the actual, the original kind of concept or theory of design patterns actually didn't come from the world of computer science or graphic design. It came from architecture. And this architect and professor, Christopher Alexander, he was a professor at Berkeley back in the 60s. And I think he's probably still there. But he had this theory that all the great places in the world were not necessarily designed by architects, but designed by the people that lived there and following patterns that have been passed down throughout their community, through their ancestors, and they've created these places that you just really want to be in, places that you go and you feel good when you're there. And so he had this theory that could kind of break down the ideas that created these spaces and make them accessible to the everyday user or home builder so that they can design their own spaces without necessarily needing an architect degree. And so he wrote his theory down in this book. It's The Timeless Way of Building. It's a pretty interesting read. I really enjoy it, and it's something I just like to pick up and open up to whatever page and start reading through, because he has some great ideas in it. There's 3 books in the series. The second one is a pattern language in which they describe, I think, 200 or so actual patterns that they've observed and tried implementing. But one of the key concepts that he talks about is that design patterns are not designed, but rather they are observed. So you can't just go out and say, I'm going to create a design pattern. There's a problem, and I'm going to solve it, and everybody's going to reuse this. You kind of design patterns coming from, yes, you have a problem, yes, you solve it, but it's not necessarily going to be right the first time. You kind of notice that you're reusing this same problem, and you end up abstracting it down to its really core concept so that it can apply to different places. So one example, they've got a pattern, I think it's called seat spots, which is, actually I've got it written down, choosing good spots for outdoor seats is far more important than building fancy benches. Indeed, if the spot is right, the most simple kind of seat is perfect. In cool climates, choose them to face the sun. and to be protected from the wind. In hot climates, put them in the shade and open to summer breezes. In both cases, place them to face activities. So what they did was they went out on the Berkeley campus, and they looked at all these different park benches, and they sat there, him and his students, and studied and actually graphed out who was sitting in what benches sucked and no one sat in, and what were the ones that were continuously occupied. And so from that, they've created this pattern. So there's just spots that people sit in, they enjoy using them, they feel good, and so it's something that we can then repeat in other spaces. So in thinking about that, as you're writing code, writing your CSS, just be mindful of the stuff that feels good when you're writing it. You're just cranking away and you're crushing some site, and it's like, yes, everything's going right. This is going in the right place. No amount of super long content is going to break this layout. And then think about that stuff, write it down, make it repeatable, and try to figure out what the essence of that problem is, and then just keep applying it to your work, and then share it with others. I think that's very important in these patterns. I think they, pretty much everything I've talked about here, not everything, but the actual naming and trying to describe these patterns is stuff that I've just been doing in my personal work, but I need, and as part of this presentation, is sharing it with you. And I'd like feedback. I want other people to create their own patterns. And we need to vet them with each other and decide if, some of this really works or if it's bullshit. But I find that all this stuff is working well for me. So with that, I thank you. I think we have time for, I don't know if we have time. So I may have gone a little long. Not sure if we have time for questions, but yeah, you're good. Okay, cool. Does anyone have questions? Because we have time. Yes.
You mentioned the patterns website, but yeah, I have found that to be kind of not that helpful. Is there a repository where we could all be, putting some of these?
There should be. I think that one was open to submissions. As far as I know, there was one designer, I think based out of Switzerland or Germany, that was actually curating that. And from what I can tell, hasn't done anything with it in the last couple of years. So I don't know. I'd be interested in working with people to start one.
There was that tends to make a Drupal-specific set of UI guidelines, UI patterns. I'm not sure how far it went, but I know people were working on it.
Cool.
So it's somewhere on Drupal level, I think.
Yeah, and that would be, I think that was more analogous to the UI patterns. Yeah. And this is what you create for a UI.
When is the right time to use vertical tabs from the Drupal interface? What's the
yeah.
right time to use a field group? When's the right time to use other things? Aside from the fact that as a model developer, I kept pushing the UI folks to start building one because I wanted to be able to leverage it.
Right.
And eventually they started making something. I'm not quite sure what happened with it, but I know they were working on it.
Cool. That actually, in terms of just responsive design in general, Brad Frost's collection that he started is actually open to submissions. I believe it's just submit a pull request on GitHub. Yes?
I've noticed, I'm new to all this stuff, but I feel like I've noticed recently or over the last year or so, sites that have moved away from, a lot of sites have moved away from multiple columns and complex patterns to sort of a single with scrolling top to bottom kind of pattern.
Yeah.
What is that about? What's happening?
I won't blame it, but I would say that has a lot to do with responsive design and that rows of relevant content that I was speaking to. So if you're packing all that content into a tight space, it makes it really hard, and it takes a lot of extra code in order to rearrange that stuff for different screen sizes. So I think that has a lot to do with it. I also think people are just, with the advent of touchscreens, just becoming more comfortable with scrolling as well.
I mean, the design for Drupal site itself, I'm looking at this sort of in that mode, which strikes me as interesting.
Yeah, a lot of it too is just, I think, better design sensibilities and like really focusing what you're looking at. I mean, the more stuff you have on the page at one time, I mean, if you show 5 things, you show nothing. Like, you need to be able to focus and actually see what's there. That's my personal thought on it.
I think a lot of that has to do with the type of site, though, too. Like, medium and box has certainly gotten a lot of attention for that content design pattern, and really nothing but the content. But it's not always appropriate. So it really does depend on what the purpose of the site is, to determine whether or not that's going to be the right answer. I mean, it does let you focus just on the content, but if that's not the only point of the site, then that might be to the detriment of its usability.
Yeah, and it's also a page-specific decision. I think on our Colorado Public Radio site, our landing pages are, frankly, pretty busy. We're trying to pull in content from 3 different radio stations, different news organizations. But when you get down to like an article page, they are slimmed down quite a bit. And the page is less focused on kind of this portal idea of browsing to find the content that you're looking for, down to we found our content, we know what we're showing. And I think with conference websites now, there's so many conference websites that people are starting to figure out that what is it that people actually need from this site. Yes?
Are there any strategies for dealing with IE8 and those kind of long scrolling away?
Typically so in terms of responsive design, we actually as a company don't support IE8 anymore unless the client specifically asked for it. But so our usual strategy is that we load a specific, like our preprocessor or SMACSS allows us to output a separate style sheet that has no media queries, it only has the desktop queries. And we load that specifically for IE8 or use Modernizer for browsers that don't support media queries. I think that's probably the best solution. All right. Well, thank you very much.